The world was still spinning when the headlines hit, when the shock settled over Hollywood like ash from an emotional wildfire that no one saw coming. Malcolm Jamal Warner, gone, vanished into eternity, not with the quiet dignity befitting the man who played the golden son of Black America's first family, but with a cry that shattered the silence of every false friendship, every broken promise, every unresolved wound that bled beneath his carefully curated smile. And though they said it was the ocean that took him, that the waves pulled him under in a Costa Rican paradise where he was meant to find peace, what really drowned that night wasn't his body, but his belief that love could still save him. And now, with every hour that ticks by since his death, the air grows heavier with confession, betrayal, and a trail of broken whispers that leads straight to the two women who knew him best. Tempest Bledsoe, the once beloved co-star who wore the crown of his unspoken love, and Felicia Rashad, the on-screen mother who once swore she'd never let Theo down, now holding the last truths of a man who died screaming in silence. And it all began unraveling with a voicemail, a private tear-soaked letter, and a final phone call no one can unhear. The sound of heartbreak so pure it made the internet freeze in its tracks. A voice memo recovered from Malcolm's locked phone, simply titled, "For Claire," where he says, in a voice cracked like old vinyl, "Tell Tempest I forgive her. Claire, I'm ready." And in that single line, everything he never said screamed louder than every line he ever recited on set, because this wasn't just a goodbye. It was the last thread of a man unraveling in real time, a final plea to the two women who were supposed to hold his soul when everything else collapsed, but instead stood back while he drowned in memory, in betrayal, in the echo of a love that proved to be nothing more than a beautiful lie wrapped in nostalgia. And when that voicemail leaked, when Tempest's voice shook through sobs on a second audio file, "If you forgive me, maybe I'll never forgive myself." It didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like guilt's funeral, because she knew what her silence cost him, what walking away when he was begging her with his eyes did to a man already breaking under the weight of years lived for everyone else's happiness but his own. And now, Felicia Rashad, the stoic matriarch, the dignified queen of black television, is breaking her silence after years of protecting Malcolm's pain, telling us the truth not as a celebrity, but as the only person who saw the storm gathering behind his eyes, the night she visited him alone, just hours before the world lost him for good. No paparazzi, no fans, just her and the boy she raised on screen, now reduced to a shadow, opening his door only to collapse into her arms, silent, shaking. No tears, just a weight that clung to her like a child begging not to be left behind, and she held him like a mother who knew she was touching goodbye itself, whispering back, "I see you, baby," while he handed her a handwritten note that simply read, "Some lights burn so quietly, you don't know they've gone out until you're left in the dark, and that's where we are now, a world cast into darkness, trying to decode the secrets behind Malcolm's final days. A mystery bleeding across timelines, retweets, and memorial murals as the truth unspools like a horror film no one wanted to star in, but everyone keeps watching. Because this wasn't just a death. It was a public unmasking of private hell, and at the heart of it was that fateful reunion just 3 nights before his passing. A private Cosby cast gathering meant to honor decades of laughter, but that ended with Malcolm walking out, wrist snatched away from Tempest's trembling grip, eyes empty, and no one knew it then. But that was the last time anyone would see him alive in public. The last time he showed up for a world that had stopped showing up for him long ago. Because that night, the city swallowed him whole, his playlist, a funeral procession of songs from their youth. And 3 hours later, Felicia's phone rang with a blocked call. She almost didn't answer, but when she hit play on the voicemail, her knees buckled. Tempest's voice, shaking, sobbing, confessing. He asked if I ever loved him, and I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just couldn't carry both of us anymore. And in that silence, the betrayal was complete. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't paranoid. He was abandoned, gaslit, discarded by the one person he'd built his adult world around. And then the final voice memo, the one that's not for the public, but now exists like a ghost in every post. A quiet message labeled, "For the ones I never got to say goodbye to," where Malcolm says, "I never stopped being that 12-year-old boy, Claire. You held me together. Now tell them, I'm sorry I stayed silent." And those final words, "Tell Tempest I forgive her. Claire, I'm ready," play on loop in the minds of. And just when the dust seemed to settle, when the headlines began to fade, and the public thought they had wept all the tears they could for the man they grew up calling Theo, part 2 of the storm came thundering back. Not from an insider or a co-star this time, but from a journalist who'd been quietly investigating Malcolm's final months, someone who received an unmarked package containing flash drives, photos, and handwritten pages so personal they looked more like grief-stained diary entries than anything meant for the public. And on those drives were more than just voice memos. They were time-stamped recordings, video confessions, and a chilling folder labeled "Contingency, if I don't make it back." And suddenly, this wasn't just a tragedy, it was evidence. And with each click, each file opened, the portrait of a man on the edge became clearer, more devastating, and undeniably deliberate, because Malcolm had been documenting his descent in real time, not just to preserve his truth, but to ensure the world knew who failed him when the silence became too loud to bear. And at the center of this digital graveyard was a long, uninterrupted voice memo, dated 4 weeks before his Costa Rica trip, where Malcolm's voice sounds eerily steady, not broken, not frantic, but composed, like a man who's made peace with pain and is simply setting the record straight. If you're hearing this, then someone finally cared enough to look. So let me say this now. I wasn't weak. I was tired. There's a difference. I gave everything to people who only loved versions of me they could benefit from. The rest? They left. And then, heartbreakingly, a pause before he whispers, "I would have carried her through fire. She wouldn't even cross a room for me." And everyone knew who he meant. Tempest, the woman who shared his screen, his youth and his soul, who now stood buried beneath waves of shame and grief while the world devoured the details of a romance that was never publicly confirmed but now, posthumously, was being dissected with surgical precision as if the viewers needed an origin story to justify the heartbreak. And as the files kept leaking, as journalists began dropping exposés and podcasts scrambled to build timelines from fragments of his last days, one thing became terrifyingly clear. Malcolm had known, long before he walked into the sea, that he was already gone in the eyes of the people he loved, and among the most painful pieces was a private video titled "Untitled, Not Acting," showing Malcolm sitting alone in a dimly lit apartment, staring into the camera with sunken eyes, saying, "You want to know what it's like to be loved for a memory? To walk into a room and be someone's nostalgia instead of someone's present?" And the silence after that line was more haunting than any scream, because for the first time, fans saw not Theo, not the actor, not the icon, but the man who had been mourning his own absence while he was still alive. And while some questioned why these files were being leaked, why his privacy was being shredded for headlines, others argued that Malcolm wanted this story told, that the very act of organizing and labeling these files with such precision was his final performance, not as a victim, but as a man desperate to be seen for the first time, even if it meant being seen too late. And Felicia Rashad, once the keeper of his dignity, found herself forced into the public eye once again when a private email she had written to producers of The Cosby Show was leaked by an anonymous source, and in it she wrote, "You all saw it too. You saw him fading, disappearing under the weight of being Theo for the rest of his life. And yet no one said a word, and the backlash was instant, with fans demanding to know how a village that claimed to raise him could have let him wither. And while Felicia refused to address the leak directly, she did make a cryptic post on her personal blog just 3 words long. He was real, and that was enough to set off a firestorm of theories, reactions, and debates, because if Malcolm was real, then what was the rest? The show, the legacy, the manufactured reunion specials that painted a false picture of unity while he was crumbling behind the scenes. And then, just when the outrage reached a fever pitch, another bombshell dropped. An old friend of Malcolm's, someone he'd known since his teenage years, released a podcast episode titled "He Warned Us," where he read excerpts from a series of unsent letters Malcolm had written to Tempest, dated as far back as 2010, where he pleaded for clarity, for honesty, for anything that felt like closure. "You look at me like a stranger now," one letter read, "and it's worse than hate. At least hate means I matter enough to be felt." And another, dated just a year before his death, simply read, "You once promised you'd never leave, and then you left while I was still holding on." And as the candlelight vigil in Harlem faded into the shadows of the night, with Tempest Bledsoe's trembling voice still echoing, "He died thinking I didn't love him," the world didn't just mourn, it fractured, because somewhere between grief and outrage, silence and exposure, something irreversible had been set in motion. A reckoning that could no longer be confined to hashtags and trending topics, and by the time the sunrise painted New York in gold, a coalition of fans, mental health activists, and former black child stars had filed an official petition to Congress for a federal inquiry into industry practices surrounding mental health negligence, particularly the treatment of young black actors once their value fades in white-dominated markets. And what began as a tribute was now a movement, one that spread across cities, languages, and generations as clips of Malcolm's final monologue, "Make It a Revolution," played on loop at protests, rallies, and even school assemblies. But behind the activism was still an unresolved storm, because while Malcolm's soul had ignited a fire, his estate had ignited a war, and that war centered around a 17-page legal document he drafted just months before his death, titled The Exit Clause, which named not only the people he wanted excluded from posthumous profits, but listed, line by line, those he believed had contributed to his emotional collapse. And at the top of that list wasn't an agent or executive or even a tabloid, but Tempest Bledsoe, with a chilling addendum handwritten beneath her name. "You were the only one who had the key, and still, you let me drown." And when TMZ leaked the clause, all the public sympathy she had gained from the vigil evaporated into a tidal wave of online rage, with fans dissecting every smile she'd shared on red carpets with Malcolm, every tribute she had failed to post over the years, every time she had remained silent when rumors of his loneliness surfaced. And now her face was everywhere, not as the grieving co-star, but as the alleged ghost who haunted his final days. And while some argued it was cruel to scapegoat her for a man's death, others said she had become the symbol of a much deeper betrayal, the kind where love is weaponized through absence, where emotional proximity becomes more damaging than hate. And to make matters worse, former Cosby Show insiders began breaking their NDAs, speaking anonymously to media outlets and revealing that Malcolm had attempted multiple times over the past decade to get the cast to publicly address their fractured relationships, but was repeatedly shut down, told it would damage the legacy. And as more receipts surfaced, including emails from producers referring to Malcolm as the brooding liability, the question became not just how he died, but how many people had profited from his quiet suffering. And then came the most haunting twist of all. A leaked email from Bill Cosby himself